In today's video in relation to the Jahm bin Safwan series, we will be discussing Ja'ad bin Dirham, the teacher of Jahm bin Safwan, his ideas and his influence on Islamic theology. To begin with, Ja'ad is credited with having been initially from Khurasan, the stretch of land spanning from from parts of Iran to Afghanistan and to parts of southern Pakistan. He was supposedly loyal to or supported the Banu Marwan, the Marwanid family, which was a branch of the Umayyads. The Marwanid family consolidated Umayyad rule post the rule of Yazid. They were eventually overthrown by the Abbasids, but they still remained in power in Spain after a while. He stayed in Damascus, meaning Ja'ad bin Dirham, and he lived close to the institution of the church in Damascus, as is mentioned by Ibn Asakir in his History of Damascus. Interestingly, Dr. Yasir Qadi, in his Maqala Jahm bin Safwan, makes a very interesting deduction. He says that it is possible that Ja'ad took from Saint John of Damascus. Saint John of Damascus lived around that time period, and he had similar ideas to the Mu'tazila, who would come about later on. Considering that Ja'ad lived in close proximity to the church institution of Damascus, it is completely possible that he could have been influenced by the ideas of St. John of Damascus, whose ideas were very strikingly interesting to that of the Mu'tazila would come later on. St. John of Damascus was influenced by St. Cosmas the Syrian, and he in turn was influenced by many Greek philosophers. Interestingly, Dr. Yasir Qadi, in this work of his, he imitates the practice of many classical Islamic theologians to draw a chain of transmission of the religious ideas of certain individuals back to their source. Ja'ad bin Dirham is credited as being the first to have said that the Quran was created. أول من قال بخلق القرآن. He is said to be Marwan bin Muhammad's teacher, meaning Marwan II of the Umayyad dynasty, who ruled from 744 to 750 CE. He was the last Umayyad caliph. Ja'ad bin Dirham was killed by the capable yet harsh Umayyad governor Khalid bin Abdullah al-Qasri on the day of Eid al-Adha. He was the first who expressed this belief, meaning the belief of the createdness of the Quran in the Mohammedan nation. As a result, the Umayyads sought after him to punish him. He fled and went to Kufa. Jahm thus learnt this doctrine of the createdness of the Quran from him in Kufa. Jahm would later on be killed by Salm bin Ahwaz in Isfahan Salm bin Ahwaz was an Umayyad governor who tried to suppress Abbasid revolutions in Khurasan and Sistan to little success, as the Abbasids would eventually overthrow the Umayyads. Interestingly, like has already been mentioned, classical heresiographers and classical theologians tended to trace chains of transmission for religious ideas back to their origin, and they give a supposed isnad, chain of transmission, for Jahmi or Jahmite theology. As such, it is mentioned that Ibn Abi Dawood took from Bishr al-Marisi, Bishr al-Marisi took from Jahm, Jahm took from Ja'ad, Ja'ad took from Abban bin Sim'an or Sam'an, who took from Talut, the son of Labid's sister and his son-in-law, who took from Labid bin A'asam, the Jewish man who cast a spell on the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Supposedly, and again, we have to take into account that not all narrations and not all of these traditions are completely authentic from a historical perspective. And in reality, we seem to know very little authentically regarding Ja'ad and Jaham, because the main historical literature on them comes 2 to 3 centuries after their passing. And also, in many cases, like was mentioned in part 2, opponents or theological heretics tend to be misrepresented or misportrayed, and in many cases, inauthentic information is used about them. So we have to be very careful when reading these things. Apparently, Labid bin A'sam used to read the Quran, and he spoke of the greatness of the Torah. Talut was the first to write down such an innovation, and Talut was supposedly a Zindiq, a heretic who disseminated his heresy secretly, and Ja'ad was the first to start teaching it publicly and announcing it, and then Jaham took it a step further. Khalid bin Abdullah al-Qasri killed Ja'ad on the day of Adha, meaning Eid al-Adha. He was the governor of Kufa at the time on behalf of the Umayyads. He prayed and gave the khutbah, the sermon for the Eid prayer, and in the end he said the following: Insarifu wa dahru. Go away, depart, and offer your sacrifices. تقبل الله منا ومنكم. May God accept from us and from you. فإني أريد أن أضحي اليوم بالجعد بن درهم. For indeed today I intend to sacrifice upon this day with Ja'ad bin Dirham, meaning, my Eid sacrifice for. As such, Ja'ad bin Dirham was to be executed on this day by the governor of Kufa at the time. He further said, فَإِنَّهُ يَقُولُ مَا كَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا. For indeed he said that Allah did not speak to Musa directly. وَلَاتَّخَذَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ خَلِيلًا. And that he did not take Ibrahim as an intimate friend. So he was from the first to introduce these two particular beliefs, which have been specifically mentioned regarding him, within the Mohammedan nation. And this is in direct contradiction to the Quranic text, which mentions that that God spoke to Musa directly, God spoke to Moses directly, and that God took Abraham as an intimate friend. The discussions regarding the meanings of these words and whether these should be taken literally or not was a slightly later theological discussion, but Ja'ad bin Dirham and Jahm bin Safwan went directly to the extremes of denying those attributes for God, according to the orthodox perspective, and as such they were deemed as heretics. تعالى الله عما يقول الجعد بن درهم علوا كبيرا. Exalted is God from what Ja'ad bin Dirham says, a high exaltation or great exaltation. Then he descended ثم نزل وحز رأسه بيده بالسكين. Then he descended from the pulpit and he cut his head off with his hand with a knife. Ibn Kathir in his Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya mentions that هو أول من قال بخلق القرآن. He is the first who spoke with the greatness of the Quran. Of course, later on in Islamic theology and Islamic history, this has become a very contentious issue, as the Mu'tazila would attempt to impose this creed upon the Muslim masses, and we'd later have the Mihna, the Inquisition of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and that would be viewed as a triumph for traditionalist Islam over ultra-rationalist Islam. But that is a later discussion anyways, and the point being here is that we can see how these early ideas of Ja'ad and Jaham went on to influence later Islamic theology. In particular, the Jahmites and Ja'ad's theology influenced the Mu'tazila. And the second Umayyad Caliph, funnily enough, he is sometimes attributed to Ja'ad, so he is called Marwan al-Ja'adi. Sometimes he is called Marwan al-Himar. Marwan al-Himar meaning Marwan the donkey. And it's kind of obvious to understand why he's the last of the Umayyad Caliphs, and his empire pretty much crumbled under the revolt of the Abbasids during his reign, so it would have been quite common to disrespect him. Ibn Kathir relates what Ibn Asakir mentions, So Ibn Kathir would have relied upon what Ibn Asakir again. Again, this raises the issue which I already raised earlier in the video, that Ibn Asakir writes 2 to 3 centuries after the death of Ja'ad bin Dirham and Jahm bin Safwan, and although his literature serves as a primary source on their lives, but in reality, because he's writing 2 to 3 centuries after their deaths, can we be entirely sure what he's writing is authentic or not? That's the job of scholarship, to discern and distinguish between what is authentic, what is authentically related, or what isn't authentically related.